Hey everyone, and welcome to our podcast, Who Gets to Tell the Story? I'm Cherlin.
I'm Nia,
I'm Cassie.
and today we're diving into a topic that is becoming more and more important in film, media, and TV.
Who has the right to tell someone else's story?
We're especially focusing on representation in marginalized communities, queer, trans, and others, and how the media can either honor those experiences or exploit them.
We'll be using two films from our French Kiss class today, Tomboy and BPM, along with some outside sources like Bohemian Rhapsody, Euphoria, and the article Who Gave You the Right to Tell That Story.
Tomboy is a film directed by Celine Sciamma that discusses a child, Mikhail, who poses as a boy with the kids in his community. 10-year-old Mikhail enjoys acting as a boy, even though it does come with challenges. Eventually, the truth regarding Mikhail's gender identity is unveiled, and this film explores that entire experience.
BPM, or Beats Per Minute, is a movie directed by Robin Campillo. Nathan is a young man that joins an AIDS activist group in 1990s Paris. As he attends the weekly meetings, he learns that some members prefer a more radical approach to their protests. The film is set in a backdrop of the nature of activism and protests in France during the AIDS epidemic.
In class, we noticed there was a constant theme of novels, readings, or videos that were directed by people who never actually experienced the stories. However, there were also films and content created by people who had lived these experiences. We noticed the portrayal between the two were noticeably different, which led us to this question.
Our goal isn't just to give you one answer, but to have a real conversation about who gets to tell these stories, how they are told, and what it means for the people who live them. It's more complicated than we might think, so let's get into it.
Let's start with Tomboy. This film tells the story of a young trans child named Mikhail, but it's directed by Celine Sciamma, who's not trans herself. The film does a great job of avoiding harmful stereotypes, but we do have to ask, can someone outside of an identity tell that story accurately?
I think that's such a key question. On one hand, Sciamma does a great job in terms of being sensitive to Mikhail's experience. The film's subtlety and the way it shows his internal struggles, especially when dealing with his gender identity, is well done.
But at the same time, it's also hard to ignore the fact that Sciamma isn't trans herself. So you wonder, would this story feel different if told by a trans director? Would it feel more personal?
Yeah, I totally agree. While Tomboy is sensitive and portrays a trans experience with care, it still feels a little distant. It's like it's observing from the outside. Sciamma doesn't have the lived experience of being a trans person.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So basically, she's working from a place of sympathy rather than empathy, which is still important, but it's not the same as a lived experience. And that subtle difference can change the emotional weight of a film.
Exactly. And I think it's a really fine line between sympathy and authenticity. And then there's also the question of opportunity. Why wasn't a trans filmmaker given the opportunity to tell this story? So maybe the best way for an outsider to support a marginalized community is to help amplify voices from within the community.
Yeah, instead of taking the spotlight, the focus should be on giving those voices space to be heard.
Right. And that speaks to something even bigger. Who gets the platform? Who's in control of the narrative? Because when we think about who gets to tell these stories, it's not just about the story itself, it's about power.
And that ties into the article we were talking about from the author Leela Shapiro, who touches in on her article, Who Gave You the Right to Tell That Story? She talks about the ethical responsibility of who gets to tell a story and argues that stories shouldn't be taken from those who haven't experienced them firsthand, as that can lead to inaccurate representations of identity.
I feel like we see a lot of this in the media. People from marginalized communities often don't have the same opportunities to create and share their stories.
And it's not just about having representation in front of the camera. It's also about who's behind the scenes, including the directors, the producers, the writers. When those in charge aren't from the community they're depicting, there's a real danger of losing the depth and authenticity of that story.
And that brings us to BPM, which was directed by Robin Campillo. He was not only part of the ACT UP movement during the HIV/AIDS epidemic, but he also lived through the crisis. You can feel the difference then between BPM and Tomboy. Campillo doesn't just depict the events of the epidemic, the film is rather filled with memory, emotion, and urgency. So there's a real weight to it.
It's layered and messy, in a good way. You can tell Campillo isn't afraid to show complexity because it's his story too. That gives it authenticity that's hard to replicate.
And that's where the idea of authorship really matters. When someone from the community tells a story, it often feels more grounded, less like a performance and more like the truth. I think this is where BPM really stands out.
I totally agree. It doesn't shy away from the difficult topics of history, including the fears, the loss, the anger, and more associated with this event. And it's not just about the fight for survival, it's about the fight for visibility. The film feels real because it's coming from someone who's actually there, who fought on the front lines of the AIDS crisis. It's layered and emotional, and it's incredibly honest.
And I think that's really the heart of why authorship really matters. When someone from the community tells a story, it's not just an account, it's their truth.
For sure. It's grounded in their lived experiences. That's why BPM resonates so strongly. It's not just about showing what happened, it's about showing the emotional truth of those moments.
Exactly. It's about telling a story from the inside out, and not just the outside in. When Campillo tells a story, he's not just educating or dramatizing history, he's sharing a piece of his life. And I think that adds so much depth. The pain, the urgency, and also the love, it's all so real because it's coming from someone who knows what it means to live through it.
That's where I think Tomboy and BPM really diverge. Tomboy is a great film, but it still feels like it's on the outside looking in. It doesn't have the same sense of lived experience, and that's something we can't ignore. And I think it's a similar story with a lot of films about marginalized communities. When the filmmakers aren't from those communities, there's often a sense of distance.
I like how you mentioned how it feels outside in. You can tell they're working from research or empathy, but there's a difference between understanding something intellectually and actually living through it.
But that's not to say that outsiders can never do justice to these stories. Maybe they shouldn't be this one-centered when others could speak for themselves, though.
There definitely is responsibility in telling these stories. If you are an outsider, you should do the research, listen, and collaborate with those who are from that community. It's not enough to just imagine what it's like and then call it a day.
Yeah, and I think it's also about being held accountable. If you're telling someone else's story, you have to think about how you're doing it. Are you representing their experience honestly? Are you giving them space to speak for themselves, or are you taking their voice away in some way?
And it's also about making sure that the story doesn't just serve your own vision or your goals. If you're telling a story about a marginalized group, is it more about their experience or is it just a way for you to tell a different kind of narrative? We can dive into now Bohemian Rhapsody, which is about Freddie Mercury, the lead singer of Queen, who defies stereotypes and conventions to become a beloved entertainer. The band's popular songs led to Queen's rise in the 1970s, and after leaving the group to pursue a solo career, Mercury reunited with Queen for the Benefit Live concert, which is one of the most memorable performances in rock and roll. The movie was made in 2018 by Bryan Singer and Dexter Fletcher.
Is it for entertainment or true passion for representation from the creator? In Bohemian Rhapsody, for example, while Freddie Mercury's life is shown on screen, critics like Naren Shedegar have pointed out that the film fails to truly explore Mercury's sexuality and identity in a meaningful way.
Also, the film's creators had an opportunity to make a much bolder statement about queer representation, but instead they softened the narrative to cater to broader audiences. This is exactly what happens when stories about marginalized communities are filtered and censored, especially with the goal of maximizing profit in mind over creating representation.
Yeah, and when you think about it, it's not just about representation, it's about authentic representation. For example, one of our other references was an article about Euphoria by Inc. magazine. The show portrays marginalized communities like queer youth. Euphoria is a show about a group of high school students as they navigate love and friendship in a world of drugs, sex, trauma, and social media. It's centered on Rue, who's a teenager battling drug addiction, and the series explores the raw emotional experience of youth today. Euphoria captures both the chaos and the vulnerability of growing up in the modern age with a large range of characters with extremely diverse backgrounds.
Yeah, but the show's portrayal of addiction, trauma, and queer identities has been critiqued for exaggerating and making too much of their struggles instead of diving deeper into them.
Critics argue that while it does give visibility, it often does so without real depth or accuracy regarding these experiences. When someone from the community tells their own story, it comes with a level of trust. Trust that the experience will be shown as it truly is, with all of its complexities, flaws, and beauty.
BPM is a perfect example of this because BPM doesn't hold anything back. It's political, personal, and it's all grounded in Campilo's lived reality. The film is unapologetic about showing the anger, the fear, and the love that define the AIDS crisis.
And I think that's something we need to keep in mind when we talk about representation. It's not just about checking off a box and saying, look, we included this group. It's about telling stories with real depth and respect.
I see what you're saying. It's about asking yourself, am I honoring the story? Am I doing it justice?
And also maybe asking, who are you making this for? And who gets to feel seen by it? When you're telling someone else's story, it's crucial to think about the impact that it has on that community. Who does the story really help and who does it hurt? Regarding who the story could potentially hurt, this was our main problem with Tomboy. When asked about the intentions of the film and its audience, Skiama commented that it was meant for all audiences regardless of age. However, it's a movie highly centered on a young child's experience on being trans, which makes that statement very problematic.
I think that this is an issue for two main reasons. First, it is odd to comment about a child's body even if the intention is not to sexualize them. Second, the intention of the film is questionable. If it is a film about a young child, can it accurately connect with a range of audiences? With Tomboy, it is doubtful whether this was done effectively regarding the thought and intention behind Skiama. If she were more careful, or even if the story were to be told by a trans director, do you think this connection with the audience would have been stronger?
Exactly. With creating and making films and being in this position of power, it is about making sure that stories are told thoughtfully and truthfully, and also with care, and with an awareness of the responsibility that comes with sharing someone else's experience. If it's not your story to tell, how do you make sure you're amplifying the stories and voices of those who live it every day?
Yeah, I agree. And no film or novel will be universally perfect to the public.
And again, with Tomboy, Skiama's not doing any harm on purpose necessarily, but there's stuff that gets missed as well as other aspects that are heavily exaggerated.
Meanwhile, BPM doesn't hold anything back. It's both political and personal because the director lived it.
So I guess what we're saying around is, it's not about gatekeeping stories, it's about being accountable when you tell one that isn't yours.
And back to Tomboy, when these stories are told, often the importance is put on the wrong topic. For example, in Tomboy, there's a high emphasis placed on genitalia, and that is often seen when the trans experience is being shown in popular media. So when you're taking an initiative, it's important to not minimize such an experience. The trans experience is so much more than just genitalia. So yeah, maybe we should be asking really, who are you making this movie for and who gets to feel seen by it?
These films should be made for the people who actually went through them. The movies and novels should be there as a voice for the people who cannot voice it themselves.
Yeah, I agree. And those same people should also be the ones feeling represented and seen. So yeah, this episode is really asking about when you tell someone else's story, what do you owe them?
I think that when you tell someone else's story, you owe them authenticity and relatability. Directors and creators should not be intentionally creating and publishing media that they cannot connect with if they are not going to tell the story accurately. They owe it to these marginalized groups and communities to tell their stories as truthfully and accurately as possible because that is what they sign themselves up for when creating a story that they may not personally connect with and is potentially not their own story. But if it's not your own story, how do you make space for the people it does belong to?
We should maybe then give more opportunities for people from those communities to be involved in the progression of media. Try to uplift creators from marginalized communities and don't be afraid to popularize it just because it doesn't apply to everyone. We can all benefit from learning more and being more educated about these topics and could lead to better chances for those from marginalized communities and even broader perspectives. So thank you so much for listening. We hope that you enjoyed the variety of opinions we had in this podcast. And the discussion doesn't have to end here. We would love to hear from you on your perspectives. So if you have a comment, please leave it below, and the first 10 comments will get a shout out in our next upload. See you next time.